On Monday, President's Day, Idahoans across the state protested federal budget cuts by President Donald Trump's administration. Hundreds showed up at the State House in Boise, while others protested in Salmon, Stanley, Twin Falls, Idaho Falls, and McCall. Those protests coincided with news that late last week, thousands of federal workers across the country received word that they had lost their jobs. Those indiscriminate cuts affected employees in their probationary periods, meaning they had been in their positions for less than 2 years. According to the Idaho Department of Labor in 2023, there were more than 13,700 federal workers in Idaho. The department tells me that the federal government hasn't informed the state how many Idahoans were fired. This week, I talked to a number of federal employees who had lost their jobs, many of whom didn't want to be named for fear of retaliation, either from their former employers or members of their own communities. One lost their job with the Bureau of Land Management, where they worked on getting critical supplies to wildland firefighters. Kyle Compere lost his job with the U.S. Geological Survey less than a year after moving from Florida to Boise to work on water projects across southern Idaho. All received the same form letter saying that their, quote, knowledge, skills, and abilities do not meet the department's current needs, unquote. Everyone I spoke to said they had no previous indication that their performance had been an issue. On Thursday, I spoke to Claire Vergobi, one of the several employees let go from the Sawtooth National Recreation Area last week, about how the layoffs might impact services for visitors. Claire, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, what was your position?
So I was an administrative support assistant on the Sawtooth National Recreation Area, which sounds like a pretty low-level job, and it was. I was a GS5, which is pretty low on the totem pole. But me and another administrative support assistant coworker and a coworker who worked seasonally in the summers were the entire visitor services and admin team for the Stanley Ranger Station. And yeah, we did admin for the SNRA as a whole. So we didn't really have anyone above us. And we were kind of we were doing all of it. So yeah.
When you say you were doing all of it, what exactly was that?
So primarily, we were the folks behind the front desk. So we answered visitor questions. If you called the phone, we were the ones answering. We, did a lot of trip planning for people and helping folks, figure out what backpacking route they wanted to take and make sure they had the most updated information on trail conditions, and, where to go, what would maybe match the kind of backpack or hike they wanted to do the best, that sort of thing. We provided a lot of educational programming. We did the junior ranger programs. And just kind of manage things generally for the Stanley Ranger Station as an office. And then on the admin side of things, we were doing pretty much all of your suspected admin tasks, mail, communications, kind of scheduling and that sort of thing for who was going to be at the front desk at headquarters and the Stanley Ranger Station. And then when I was hired, we did have a support services specialist, which is kind of basically like an office manager type position, if you're looking at private sector similarities. And so she was a step above us, but she left the agency this fall. And so my coworker and I took on all of her jobs as well, and she managed housing for the district. All of the purchasing and requisitioning for supplies, fleet tracking for vehicles, any sort of onboarding and offboarding paperwork, accountable property, uniforms, just kind of all of the things day to day that keep things running.
When did you find out you had been fired?
So on Thursday, I received a call late in the day from my supervisor, and I actually missed the call, and she left a message saying that they had just had a meeting with our district ranger, and that OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, had directed agencies to terminate all probationary employees. And so I found out that on Thursday, but we didn't receive any further information on Thursday. No termination letter, nothing. So my coworkers and I went to work on Friday, No, you're good. My coworkers and I all went to work on Friday, and we worked up until we actually received the termination letter. There's quite a pile of things you have to do when you're either let go or quit the agency. We have passes and permits in our name. We're in charge of us at the front desk. We're in charge of money, and we had purchase cards and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that needed to be kind of buttoned up, or that before we were gone. And had we only had we were given the termination letters, and actually terminated around 3:30, and the termination letters said effective immediately, but that we had until close of business to basically get stuff done. And if we had actually not known it was coming and it only had an hour and a half, we would not in any way have been able to finish all the things we had to. So it's a little bit of a stressful day. Um, and then so several of us were fired on Friday. On Sunday, several more were terminated at 5 p.m. And then on Monday around noon, another batch were terminated.
When we're looking at all of the tasks that you and all of the fired coworkers did, how is that going to impact services at the SNRA?
I can't say for sure, because one thing I will say is that all of my coworkers, the ones who were terminated and the ones who are still there, are incredibly dedicated and hardworking people. And I know that they're going to do the best that they can to provide the services that people expect to have here on the SNRA. That being said, we lost, as I said, our visitor services and admin crew for the entire district. Um, we lost our entire trails and wilderness crew, the folks who are like out on the trails, clearing the trails, packing trash out of the wilderness, educating visitors. Our recreation program took a huge hit, like for Front Country Recreation, which are the folks, dealing with campgrounds and cleaning the bathrooms. And our fish and range programs took a huge hit too. So I think that everyone who's left is going to do as much as they possibly can, again, to provide the services that folks expect from us. But our we had 16 folks fired from the SNRA of 37 total permanent employees, which is 43% of our workforce. And I don't think it's going to be possible to fully, I don't know what they're going to do. And I'm sure that there's going to be effect seen on the SNRA this summer, especially if we have as busy of a summer that we're kind of predicting that we will, since so many folks had to cancel plans last summer because of the fires. So yeah, I think it'll be noticeable.
When you look at past feedback from supervisors or employee performance reviews, anything like that, was there any indication prior to this that your performance or your coworkers' performances were an issue?
No, so yeah, I think there's a little bit of context required for the idea of probationary status with the feds in the first place, which is that most probationary periods for the Forest Service, at least, are 1 to 2 years, depending on the job and the type of appointment. So they're pretty long probationary periods. Probationary periods also restart quite frequently. So if you move from seasonal work into a permanent job, your probationary period restarts. It doesn't matter if you had 10 seasons of seasonal trail work. If you get on permanently, you start new. If you move from a non-supervisory role to a supervisory position, oftentimes your time restarts. If you're, move from one job to another, one permanent job to another, sometimes the circumstances mean that your probationary period starts. So most of the folks who were terminated in this, at least on our forest, were not actually new employees. I have a coworker who was terminated after over a decade of service. And probationary employees are much easier to fire than any other employee, for sure, but you do still have to have a reason. And those reasons are usually related to misconduct or performance issues. And so everyone I know with the Forest Service, every letter I've seen, everyone received the same form letter with the same reason for termination. And that reason was the agency finds, based on your performance, that you have not demonstrated that your further employment with this agency would be in the public interest. And for this reason, essentially, you're being removed from your position. There was no evidence of that fact. I have never received anything other than satisfactory or exceeds expectations on a performance review. I have received commendations for my work. That's all reflected in my personnel file. And usually, if you are terminated, even as a probationary employee, you they have proof of that. They have proof of the reason behind it. Um, but it's simply there is no proof that I ever had any performance issues. Um, and that goes for just about everyone who was terminated.
All right, Claire Vergobi, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.